So I guess we'll get started with our roll call.
Mayor
Yes.
Rodwell,
Here?
Vice Mayor Thompson.
Here.
You also have staff members, our fiscal clerk, Ms. Andrews, myself. We have our auditor who's going to be giving a report, and our CPA, Ms. Rebecca Williams.
Thank you very much. Do we have any public comments?
I have none. Please.
Okay.
I set them right there so that you could get what you need.
Where are our rest of them? All right, hold on one second. I apologize. So the audits were distributed in a wonky way. I want to make sure that everybody has the correct audit. I'm still missing. Perfect. CRA, there we go. There we go.
Oh, okay.
Oh, yeah. there's
Okay,
two
now they
different
have the CRA and.
We now we have both.
They've been emailed
Got
for
it.
review, but I want.
ones. Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
So,
I apologize, Madam Mayor. Now that you do have the CRA and our audit, then I would like to bring up our auditor to go through both the CRA and the City of Keystone Heights audit. So we have Mr. Brad Millian here to just review that with us today.
sure.
Okay,
Thank you so much for being here.
sure. Thank you for having me. And feel free to interrupt me along the way or at the end. You can save your questions for at the end and so forth. I know that it can be a little overwhelming. We've got the city document is 50 pages long. And so there's all these different elements that are required to be in an audit report. That's why it's so long and so forth. And you have 4 or 5 different funds, so we kind of want to touch on each of them. So what I like to do is kind of give you some highlights and so forth, and then if you have some questions, we can go through it. First of all, we've always like to tell you that we've issued clean opinions. They're called unmodified opinions. That's kind of what you expect on each of the financial statements, so that's good news. We had a few more accounting adjustments than expected, and that led to a couple compliance issues, so we'll get to those towards the end. But usually what I do is I go through each of the different funds, and the first one would be the general fund on page 37.
But you're thicker of the two packets.
We kind of like to go through the results for the year in the context of how your budget and your actual and how the numbers fared out and so forth. So that first total up there is the total revenues. And the numbers were really pretty well in line with your budgets with the exception of the intergovernmental programs, and that's because that includes grant funds. So a lot of times there's a certain amount of guesswork involved there. And so it's perfectly normal to have some serious fluctuations there. Kind of the same deal in your expenditures. If you scan down to that second subtotal, you'll see the economic environment, the capital outlay. There was a wide, pretty big fluctuation of 148,000. We encourage Lynn to go ahead and budget the full amount of these grants because you're not sure how much you're going to spend. And so then oftentimes the actual turns out to be a lot less. But that's a lot safer budget process than having to go back and amend if you go overboard. So if you go ahead and budget the full amounts of what you expect to receive and spend, then you're usually generally in a safe zone there. So again, getting back to revenues, being conservative, you came in really close and the expenditures fared well. Not many fluctuations there, so that was good. Then flipping to the next page is the CRA. That's also a required supplemental schedule, so we can kind of look at that fund and see how you fared for the year. You can see your revenues had a $46,000 adjustment, and I think that was really just an oversight. That was kind of a cash versus accrual situation where we included that 46,000 last year because it was really earned in the prior year. And I think maybe when you did the budget this year, you weren't aware of that fact because you saw that money coming in.
Right.
And so you went ahead and budgeted for it when actually we said it was related to the previous year. So that's where your CPA can come in and help you looking at your budgets and so forth and kind of saying, okay, let's look at what we had last year. Does that make sense? So at any rate, that explains that fluctuation there. And then you can see your expenditures. You went ahead and amended the budget to get close to your actual. Well, as we'll see in a few minutes in the compliance arena, when it comes to the CRA fund, we really don't want you to reduce your budget at all because it's a weird animal, the CRA. If you don't use it, you lose it. They say there's a lot of compliance issues now with the CRA. And so what you want to do is any amounts you don't spend in one year, you want to carry forward to the next year. And the easiest way to do that is just to keep your budgets intact and see what hasn't been spent, which projects, and then say, okay, we need to carry those forward to next year and add those to the budget. The CRA came over the horizon and the Auditor General created a new checklist in 2019. And they say, and a lot of people with CRA funds, you see their cash accounts getting bigger and bigger and bigger. That means they're not spending the money. Well, if you're not spending the money, you need to designate it for specific projects that you had set aside in previous year's budgets and make sure that money gets spent. Otherwise, technically, you're supposed to give the money back. Now, they've got sample reports in the Auditor General where people were really not following this at all, and it's not like the Auditor General says you need to cut a check right away. They just want to see you improve your compliance. I mean, there were some really gross examples, but that really didn't result in having to pay the money back. There's just a mechanism just to comply with the law so you don't have to give the money back. And we'll touch on that a little bit more. And then flipping the page to the Capital Improvements Fund, this is on page 39. This fund was created last year as a spinoff off your general fund. And this is for the discretionary sales surtax that you set aside for your infrastructure improvements and so forth. So since it's a special revenue fund, it's also required to have this special report here. And of course, you see that your revenues were a little bit different. The actual comes in greater than budget, which is always a good sign that you're being conservative. But the expenditures the actual ended up being a lot larger than your budget. And so that's a no-no. So that was the compliance issue. And a large part of that issue was because you had two different cash accounts that we were merging. And as we'll talk a little bit later, the accounting wasn't done in an all-in-one inclusive manner, and so some numbers were lost along the way. When you were looking at analyzing the budget, you didn't have a full picture there. So Lynn always is fairly diligent at the end of the year, September. You have 60 days to amend your budget till the end of November. So a lot of times you wait and see what the final numbers are and then look and go, okay, are we good, are we bad, do we need to make an amendment? And in this case, she didn't have the full picture, so she didn't make the right decision there. So then when the actual numbers came in and we had to merge these two accounts together, we ended up having some pretty significant adjustments there that ended up resulting in this little situation. I'm throwing a lot at you, so if you have any questions, just feel free to stop. So we've looked at the three different governmental funds. So then if we want to look at the balance sheet related to those on page 14, we show all those in separate columns. So there's really no surprises there. You still have adequate funding. There's no urgent messages I need to convey. You can see the first column, the general fund, you've got $447,000 in restricted revenues. That coincides with that unearned revenue in your liability account. And so all those numbers are pretty solid. So I really just wanted to point that out. And then if we want to look at your cemetery fund on page 19, we don't have to include the budget for your cemetery fund because it's an enterprise fund, so we're just showing the results. We always like to see a positive number for your operating income, and last year you had over 20,000 more in sales and 10,000 less in expenses. So this year was kind of an anomaly in a sense that you're usually showing a profit. So it's not that big of a concern over time. If you kept showing operating losses, then you might want to increase your prices or take a look at what's going on. You've had a lot of activity over there at the cemetery the last couple of years with the mausoleum and remapping and so forth. And if you want to see on a cash basis on page 20, that first subtotal is one I always like to look at. So you're generating cash from your operations. A lot of times the previous statement we looked at has depreciation and some non-cash items that knock the number down a little bit. So that's always a good sign there, and you can see that your cash really didn't change much from the previous year. Then if you flip 2 pages forward to page 18, we look at the balance sheet for your cemetery fund. And there's a couple new numbers on here. We had a giant change in our accounting standards for long-term leases. And so now they're supposed to go on the balance sheet, where typically people are paying a monthly amount. We just call it rent expense and leave it at that. Now we had to go in and analyze your cell tower lease that has 5 10-year renewals or 10 5-year renewals. It's not supposed to expire till the year 2055. So then, based on a 3.5% borrowing rate as of the beginning of the year, we determined the value to be $505,000 for the lease is what we had to put on your books. So you'll see a lease receivable for that amount. And then if you scroll down to the middle of below, in between liabilities and net position, there's this term called deferred inflows of resources for $505,000. That kind of offsets the lease. It's kind of a pseudo liability. It's just the government accounting world that just keeps changing and comes up with these new terms and so forth. So those 2 items are now new on there, and there's just a note 8 disclosure that can go into more detail. Note 6 on page 30. We have to kind of explain what we're doing there. So now what happens is when you receive 17, how much is it that we get? You're getting roughly $17,000 a year in lease payments. A portion of that's going to be interest as opposed to rent lease. So we're just breaking that up. But the first 2 paragraphs in note 6 talk about the cemetery fund and what the rationale for capitalizing it and so forth. So that's just new. And then if you continue on page 30 and flip over to page 31, we had the same situation at the air park. They've got 3 long-term leases at their warehouses. And so we had to capitalize each one of those. And then because they're in the more of a business of providing leases to third parties, we had to add these extra disclosures that at the bottom of page 31 that kind of formats how they're going to be getting received in the future. These are the expected monies they'll be receiving and so forth. So it was a really significant change in the accounting world. Just wanted to point that out because that's such a significant change. And then getting back to some of the findings that we had, they're listed in different pages throughout, but then since you're required to respond to them, I suggest the last 2 pages of the whole document. It kind of captures all of the items we had ended up putting in our report. It's these 2 white pages back there. They won't have numbers on them.
Oh, okay.
The first one relates to your accounts receivable at the year end. And so there were still some balances that weren't tight. You print out an age receivable listing and it's got all the different customer names. And so we're encouraging to get those customer names with the correct balance and then make sure that those balances are correct. And we ended up having a couple adjustments to the tune of $28,000 for those receivables. And so we want to make sure we pay attention to even the small amounts, because you got to have a good starting point before you can adjust it. You need to know what those balances represent by customer. So that's just kind of a pure accounting issue that needs to be addressed. It sounds like they're on their way to getting that completed. And then the second finding kind of has to do with spinning off the CIP account. We had a lake restoration account, and we also had the CIP account. It's really much easier if they're all in the same general ledger, so you can do the financial reporting that way. But because they were kept separately, when we went to merge those, we had some accounting errors as far as putting those numbers together. That's what led to the CIP, where you had an overage in your expenditures because we didn't have the full picture right there. It didn't help that you had one grant where we decided halfway through that you had to pay for some of the items out of the CIP as opposed to the general fund bank accounts, and so that got kind of sticky there. So each year is a little different, but that was certainly a challenge to go back and figure out how we needed to correct that, and then it turned out that we had to make a few adjustments to get that right. Now, merging that one bank account into the software should make everything a whole lot easier. So it should all just be in one picture. Plus that helps your internal reporting, because you want to get monthly reports on the CIP, budget versus actual. How are we doing? Do we need to make an amendment? Have we spent all this money? Are we doing the projects we're talking about? So hopefully that'll help that process as well. And that kind of led to the actual expenditures exceeding the final budgeted expenditures for the CIP, as we talked about, making sure we have all those adjustments and having those bank accounts together. That'll prevent that. And then on the CIP account, sometimes we set up new accounts, or we have a grant or what have you, but we need to be clear on the description of the expense accounts and how it relates to what department. Is it capital outlay? Is it operating expenses? You can't just have generic codes right there. I don't know how to, it's got to be more descriptive. The financial accounting standards for the state, they come out with this chart of accounts. It kind of tells you which accounts to use. I've been lenient as far as I can see. It's capital outlay or operating. I'm not going to make a big deal out of it, but sometimes it might just be better just to go straight to that example and just pick the numbers that they have in the description, so there won't be any indecisiveness as far as where that goes or what that really should be and so forth. There was also a couple findings for the Community Redevelopment Fund. We've talked about their financials, but if we want to go to the last couple pages for the second audit report. And so this is where the Auditor General came up with this new checklist, okay, at the end of 1 year, if we're not spending this money, okay, we need to roll those unused numbers by project into the next year so we don't have to give the money back. And so we were fairly correct in rolling forward 110,000 of the 113 that was available at the end of the year, but we just need to do a better job at specifying how that money is getting rolled forward to what existing projects. So like if you had streetscapes and you had 40,000 budgeted and you spent 10,000, well then you could put streetscapes for 30,000 and include that in the next year's budget. It's kind of weird. The CRA fund, you don't need a rainy day slush fund. You need to just budget all the money you have available. So look at the cash balance at the end of September, add that to whatever Clay County's gonna provide for you the following year along with your match, and that total should be what your total expenditures are. And of course, you can also include administrative expenses, audit, attorney, accounting time that they spend on it and so forth. But that budget process, which we've talked about quite a bit, just needs to be tightened up a little bit. I think we're on the right path there.
And that's been a learning process over the past 2 years. And so
Yeah. We got halfway there, but there was one step missed. So that is exactly what Mr. Millian stated was with the, specifying the projects. We carried over the funding, but it needed to be more clear on what project that was going towards, what projects that was going towards, which it was the understanding that it was going into streetscapes. However, it just wasn't clearly stated within our budget, and that's where that conversation comes from. So we'll make sure that that's taken care of this year.
And then, like I said, to reimburse the city for administrative expenses. The CRA doesn't have its own employees.
Right.
But go ahead and reimburse the general fund for some of your time. So that's a good thing. That helps pay for your accounting, you know. And I don't require that you keep timesheets or anything, as long as it's reasonable, 5 or 10,000 or somewhere in that nature. I'm not going to bat an eye. You know, that's like, how much time are you spending on the CRA fund? Be reasonable about it, and go ahead and the general fund will charge you for that time, and then that's an allowable expense. You're kind of in this, we need to figure out how we're going to spend all this money. It's kind of a good problem, right? You've got all these different projects, but you also want to make sure you cover your admin that, you know, that makes sense as far as that goes.
And just so I can clarify, we'll see that, you'll see that in this current fiscal year budget. So we have always compensated or paid for our audit fees, our attorney fees out of CRA for the CRA portion. But you'll start seeing staff time as they take care of our CRA, the admin time, as well as our CPA time it is currently being billed from general fund to CRA, so we can see those funds transfer and get reimbursed in our general fund for it.
Okay.
And then that last finding was just reiterating that it makes more sense not to decrease your budget, so you can kind of use that as a tool. So at the end of the year, you look at the budget actual, then you'll see all those budgeted items that we didn't spend on. Let's strongly consider those as part of our next year's budget and rolling over the amounts that kind of match up with the money we haven't spent so far. So progress, that's the main thing. We're just, that'll certainly help in that arena. I wasn't really prepared to talk about the airport, but we've got a guy behind me here that just say that we had a successful audit there. You had a couple people, couple commissioners that I think were in attendance over there. I don't know if they conveyed any. Bobby Brown, I think, was there and so forth.
Unless we're in a meeting.
I was there.
Okay, well, so I wasn't really prepared to talk too much about it. We always point out they have such a large depreciation number. You can see an operating loss and get concerned, but that depreciation number is so high that once you back that out, you know, and you look at the cash flow statement, they're still pretty strong and they're doing fine and so forth. I knew I threw quite a bit out at you, so I don't know if you have any questions now, or Lynn can always hunt me down, or.
So if, I'm sorry.
No, I mean, so I think the three accounts where you had some information that didn't get to you that affected some of that first part of the outcome that he was talking about, and that's just something that you just had to go back and get information, I guess, additional information.
So we have more this year than any other year, I think, have discussed processes and procedures. And I've begun one-on-one conversations with council. Madam Mayor, you and I need to sit down and have a conversation of some of the transparency and fluency through our accounts and our processes as a city. I don't, and Mr. Millian, you can tell me if you disagree or not. I don't think that we're in a bad position. I feel that we're not. We've got good processes in place. It's just being able to execute them, and we've got to make some changes.
Yeah.
And so I'll have conversations with council on what those changes are going to look like, because it is going to take an action of council.
Okay.
And so we'll move forward quickly on some processes, some of our accounts, and then we'll be in a better position to discuss that in the August meeting.
Okay. And we need to spend CRA money.
Yeah, it's a good problem.
Yep.
Yeah.
And we have budgeted, we have plans, and then now, we're getting up to that of what the CRA money is going to be utilized for. It was just I don't want to say miscommunication. We got halfway there as far as being able to carry it over, but where it needed to be called out in the budget specifically where it was being carried forward is what needs to be executed. And so you'll see that called out in a much more specific manner within this year's budget.
Yeah.
Because it is, those monies are going towards the streetscape project. And that's a conversation that the agency has had many times over. It was just a matter of putting that more clearly on paper.
Yeah, and I think there's definitely more revived interest in trying to,
Yes.
everyone coming together with the same concept and ideas. Okay.
And so I will tell you that Miss Andrews has been amazing. She has picked this up and running. She comes into my office on a regular basis, have questions and comments and various ways that we can improve. So I think that we're heading into an extremely fantastic track. And I look forward to next year and what this brings.
Good, thank you.
Sure.
And so, Madam Mayor, that's all that I have for this budget meeting.
Okay.
We do have an entire council workshop scheduled for Monday. All of you got the emails. We'll be discussing some of our projects for next year, talking about some real concerns that we have as costs increase and labor increase and some things that we're going to have to do and maybe some hard decisions with our budget moving forward for the 23-24 year.
Okay. Y'all have any questions?
No,
No?
not yet.
Tony? No? I think we're
That's
good.
all we have
I'm
for this
good.
one.
Appreciate the effort.
Sure.
It's a lot of information. But,
If you have any other questions, Lynn can always find me.
thank you. Appreciate you being here.
Thank you.
Sure.
All right, so we are adjourned.